Now the next part of this liquid ORM that I want to implement is the query builder. And again, the query builder is optional. You don't really have to put it in, but I don't particularly want to be writing queries within my CRUD, my CRUD class or my controller class. So if I can make helper functions or helper method that help us to write these queries, then I want that to be part of my ORM. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to say query builder. And like the pattern that we've been going by so far, you should know by now that we're going to be creating an interface. It'll be new file, the query builder, interface.php, and our query builder class. And let's start with our interface. So let's say PHP declare strict types equal 1. Let's say namespace magma, and we're in the liquid ORM, and we're in query builder. And I just realized that I've made a mistake with my namespace in my data mapper just realized just now what I've done. So I have not actually referenced the liquid ORM directory. I've just gone magma data mapper, but this is actually within liquid ORM directory. So I need to actually put that in. I'm just going to copy this, get into my other classes, and make that change. Again, you will make mistakes as you go along. It's just part of development. And I need to do the same for my exception classes. Just going to do it from this bit. Magma liquid ORM data mapper. Yep. And do it from this bit. Again, I said I've just realized that I've missed out the namespacing, but I've catch it before I've gone any further. So that's cool. Let's close these out now since we've adjusted those. Yep. And again, we need to adjust this down here as well. So I'm going to say let's close that out. Where else are we making that use case? Yeah, I think that's it for now. So I said the next bit that we're going to focus on is our query builder, and we're going to start off with our query builder interface. Let's close that. I'm going to say class query builder interface. Now this is going to take all the obvious different queries that we can perform, and the foremost common one is what we use for CRUD functionality or CRUD operation. The first one I'm going to put in here is insert query, and this is going to take one argument, which is going to be actually it's not taking any argument. It's just going to return a string, because are we going to implement it? We don't want to pass arguments within these method. And the second one going to be our select query. And again, they're all going to be returning a string. Fourth is going to be, or third is going to be, I should say, our update query. And the fourth is going to be our delete query. And there's a few others that I want to add in, but we're going to keep it simple and basic for now. Then when we start building or getting deep in, we're going to come back and revisit this and add a few more in. But before I do that, I want to add this one in. It's going to be public function, and it's going to be a raw query, because I also want to provide an option to write our own query within our files, depending on how complex those queries are. Because what I'm creating right here is just going to be a simple generic queries that we will use 95% of the time for our framework, and the odd time that we need something custom, I want to provide the means to do that as well. And this is going to return a string as well, because all the queries that we return, they're going to be strings. What's this? Non-abstract method must contain body. Oh, sorry, should be interface. Yeah, because we're writing our interface method. Then let's close this out. QueryBuilder, I'm going to say PHP declare strict types namespace. Let's get this right this time. Magma liquid ORM. I'm going to say QueryBuilder. Class is going to be QueryBuilder, which implements that QueryBuilder interface. Yeah. So our QueryBuilder interface is going to, I'm going to implement a constructor method. We may or may not use it at this point, but I'm going to put it in just in case. I'd like to say main constructor. And again, just going to say, for now, it's just going to return void. Now, there's a couple of stuff that I want to actually implement that's not in the interface, but they're more like just method or helper method that help us to build our queries. So a method that I've created is one called public function, and it's called build query. And this takes one argument, which is an array named args, and we're going to make it optional. Yeah, and it's going to return self because it's going to be a chaining method, and create a body for that. And what we're going to go off and say is we're going to say if count args is less than 0, we're going to throw keyboard going to throw a new QueryBuilder invalid argument exception. And we've not created this class yet. So I'm going to say new directory, so exception, and within that, let's just copy this. Within that, we're going to create that file and paste it, say .php. And let's just create that. It's going to be PHP declare strict types namespace be magma be liquid ORM. It's going to be QueryBuilder. It's going to be a long namespace, this one. exception. I'm going to say class and paste that in, and we're going to extend invalid argument exception. Nope. Yeah. And again, we're going to pass that in like that. And again, we're going to leave it just as plain as that for now. So we need to pull that in. So it's going to be Magma liquid ORM. It's going to be QueryBuilder exception. Will be exception. QueryBuilder invalid argument exception. So the idea behind this method is, depending on where we're using it, I want to be able to pass in a key value pair within the argument, and what that's going to do is I want to either merge it with the default that we're going to set within this class, or override any default value. So before I do that, I'm going to create a couple of properties, and the first one I'm going to create is a protected array, and it's going to be called key. And the second one is going to be protected, and this is going to be a constant, and it's going to be, I'm going to name it, I could say SQL parts default. Let's say SQL default, right? And it's going to be a key value pair. So let's define some default keys and values that we can change outside of this class, or override outside of this class. So the first one is going to be selectors. Let's put that all in lowercase. Selectors, and it's going to default to an empty array. Next one is going to be replace, and that's going to be false. Third is distinct, and that's going to be false as well. Fourth, let me think. Fourth is going to be the from within our query statement, and I'm going to set that to an empty array, and we need that where clause as well. That's also going to be, well, that's going to be set to null. And what else we got? We got and. These are going to set to an empty array. We got or, again, an empty array, and we've got order by, and that's going to be again an empty array, and fields, it's going to be an empty array, and you're going to see where we're using these values, these keys and value. So a primary key, that's going to be just an empty string, and next one is need a name of a table, going to be an empty string, and I'll set the type, which is going to be an empty string as well, and I'm going to say a raw, and this is going to be for raw queries. That's going to be an empty string. So back down into this method, what we're going to say is arg dot array merge, and we're going to say self, I'm going to pull in this SQL or SQL default. So it's going to be SQL default, and you want to merge it with our arguments. So how that works is, if we are using this method outside, well, for example, in a different class, we can define a key value array, and if we specify any of these keys in that argument, we can actually set the value. If we don't use any of these keys, it will just return the default value that we've set, but we can change it basically. And I want to actually store those merged data into my key property like that. And all I'm going to do is return this, because as I'm saying, this is a method that is going to be chainable, right? Let's hope you get that. And let's start writing out our methods. And the first one we're going to do is public, and it's insert query, and again that returns a string. And we need to actually check that this type key that we put in, I want to actually be able to check that we are running the correct query. So I'm going to actually create a helper method that helps us to check that we're actually doing the right thing. So it's going to be private function. I'm going to give it a name. Is valid query type, or is query type, that's it, is query type valid. I'm just trying to write method name that makes sense. I'm going to take one argument, which is going to be a string as the type, and it's just going to return a bool. So return true or false. So we're going to say if type equal self that select, or can I do this a better way than this? Actually, let's not do that. I just thought of a better way of doing it. So let's actually create a next property. It's going to be a constant as well. I'm going to call this query type, or query types. Set that to an array. We're going to have insert, going to have select, going to have update, going to have delete, and I'm going to have raw, because that's going to be part of our query type. So what I'm going to do it instead is I'm going to say if in array type self query types, you can say return true. If I can spell, return true, or else just return false. I think that will work. So if the query type that we specify is in this array, then we'll return true, because these are the array that we set, or the keys that we set. So in our insert query method, we're going to say if this is query type valid, I need to pass a key. Then if it's valid, then we're going to execute the code within this block, right? So I need to find a way to pass the actual key for this particular method. And we can be explicit and just say this is an insert method, right? let's just leave it hard code for now. We'll actually find a more dynamic way of doing it. Then what we're going to do is, let's think about what we're trying to do here. So for insert query, we know we need a key value pair. We need some keys that contain some value. So if we sort of like say if is array this key fields, so you see we've got our key property because this will contain all of this default plus whatever we pass in through this method, because we've assigned it down here. So now we've got access to these keys. So which is what we're doing. We're saying if is array fields, because the field key is going to be the array that takes in that key value pair. If that makes sense. It would make sense once you see how it's implemented. Let's close this out because we're not actually using that. Let's get a bit more space. So we're going to say if is array this key fields and count this key fields is greater than 0. Let's execute. So we're saying if it's an array, we're good, and if the count is greater than 0, which means we've got at least one element within that array, let's crack on. Now before we go any further, I've noticed an error that I've got right here. So I need to take that off, and it needs to be right there. And up in this build query method where we assign the key to args, it should be arg, because we're assigning the key to this line of code right here. So I think that's fixed. Yeah. So we've checked that we're in the right query type. We're checking that we've got an array and we've got more than one element within that array. We need to now start building out or insert query dynamically. So I'm going to actually pull up a query example to help us build this out. I'm going to comment that and do that. So that's the query that I've just pulled off the internet. It's just a random query. It's got nothing to do with what we're doing. I'm just wanting to show you how we're going to be building this out to make our query look like this. So the first thing I want to do, actually, let's do something else as well. I'll comment that out, and I'm going to put an array. So I'm going to say user equal myself. I'm going to say email equal myself example.com, and I want to say sex is a male. Right, so I've got an array. It's a key value pair or an associative array, and it's going to help us build this out. So I'm going to create a variable called index, and what I want to do is I want to get the index of this array, and the index of this array is these strings right here. So we've got user, we got email, and sex. These are what we refer to as the index of the array. So a way we can extract that from this fields or this key fields property is use the PHP function called array keys, and we're just going to pass that property in, which is this key fields, and this method will extract those keys and store it within this index variable. So now we want to try and construct our query so we can build out our query string, and create a next variable and call it value equal, and I'm going to say array implode, and I'm going to implode by a comma, and I'm going to pass those index in, because what happened is when we get this array keys, and when we extract the array keys from this associative array, we need a way to separate them, because they're going to be coming back as user, email, and sex. So we need to put a separator after each, and this is what we're doing. We're imploding that array and separating them by a comma, which is what you see right here. So we've got name, comma, surname, comma, and sex, right? So the next bit of this that we want to be implementing is we're going to do a comma, import colon, and concatenate next implode statement, which is going to be colon, and we're at comma and colon, and that's going to implode that index again, right? So we're going to say this SQL query, which is a property that we've not created. So I want to store the return query within this property. So I'm going to say equal insert into, and you can see I've used double quotes because I want to actually use variables like this. I'm going to say square bracket or curly brackets. I'm going to say this key table. So we're passing in the table name, which is what we've got in our default SQL default right here, table name. So we can insert our table name within the method or within the class we're going to be using this object in. That makes sense. So push that back over. So we're going to say insert into this table, and we're going to open and close parentheses like what we've got right here, and I'm going to say open close curly bracket. I'm going to say value at index 0, right? And that's going to print out our user, email, and sex just like this, separated by that comma, right? And we're going to say values, because that's how you write the query. That's how you get the values for the query, or store the values, just like this. And I'm going to say open close parentheses, and we're going to say value at index 1, and that's going to print out this off with the colon and comma, which is what we've defined or implode or index by down here. And all we want to do with that is return it. SQL query. And let me go up here and create this property. It's be protected. It's going to be a string. It's going to be called an SQL query. I'm going to set that to an empty string. Right, so let's get rid of that. And I'm going to say if its query type is valid, execute, else return false. Right, and that's pretty much all we're going to create our dynamic insert query. Now I believe the next one we've got in our interface is the select. I'm going to say public function select query, and I'm saying this is going to return a string as well. So like what we've did in up here, we're going to do the same check. So we're going to say if this is query type valid, and we're going to say select. We're going to change these hard code values in a bit to more dynamic values. So if query type is valid, because this is within the select query, we're going to say selectors. I'm going to create a variable called selectors. I'm going to say if it's not empty, this key this keyboard, wow. Selectors implode via comma this key selectors, else return the default, which is that asterisk. So let me explain to you what I'm doing right here. So I've created a variable that I want to store these selectors in. So I'm saying if selectors are not empty, which is these selectors within this array, if it's not empty, then I want to implode the list of selectors that we have passed to the selector key within the method argument. If it's empty, then return that asterisk. And this is part of our select query. So we can select different columns or multiple columns, or we can specify that within the selectors argument. And if we don't, we can just return the asterisk, which will return all the columns. And again, this is going to be a simple query. So we're going to say this SQL query equal select selectors from table name this key table. And that's as simple as it gets. But that's not the end, because our select query can contain where clauses, so we can actually compensate for that as well. So we're going to add or concatenate a helper method that does all the for each loop, or does all the logic for our where clauses, because we could have different where clause, we could have multiple where clauses. So we're going to actually delegate that bit to a different method. I'm going to concatenate it on to this property. So SQL query, and we're not going to concatenate it actually, we're just going to say SQL query this, and let's give it a good name, this, say build conditions. Is that a good name? So as conditions, right? And all we want to do is just return. And actually we need to have these within our if statement, because we want to return false otherwise, right? Let's put some space between that. Right, so we're going to come back to this method in a bit. Let's just crack on with the rest of the method. It's going to be public function, and I believe it's update. And again, it's going to return a string, and we want to wrap that into that method that checks that we're doing the right query. So I'm going to say is query type valid. I'm going to say update And let's have a little think about this implementation, because it's going to be similar to what we've done up here, but it deviates just a bit. So we're going to say if is array this fields, this key fields, and count this key fields is greater than 0 or have at least one element within the array, then we're good to roll. So we're going to do a for each loop. We're going to iterate over those fields or those key value pair or an associative array fields as field. So I'm going to say if field isn't this key, primary key. I'll explain to you in a minute what we're doing. We're going to say value concatenate field and equal field and a comma. Right. So what we've got here is if field isn't this primary key, then execute this block of code or set this variable to what we've defined right here. So what we're doing right here is this key primary key. So when we're doing update queries, we want to ensure that whatever was set within this primary key is not part of what we're updating, because we want to use the primary key in the where clause. And if we've got the primary key in the where clause and we've got it in the updated field, we're going to get an SQL error. So we want to make sure that that primary key is not within that field that we're trying to update. And you've noticed that I've also got a comma at the end because we're separating each key and value by a comma. But that also is going to throw a problem because on the last key value we're going to have a comma, so we need to sort of like take care of that as well. That's what we're going to do outside of this for each loop. We're going to say values. I'm going to use the sub str replace method, and we're going to say values. So this is what we're trying to replace, values via empty string at and start it at -2, and that should delete that end comma at the end of our statement. Now we're going to say if count this key fields is greater than 0, then we're going to say this SQL query is equal to our update statement, which is what we're going to create right now. So we're going to say update this key table, and we're going to say set indent. I don't know why it keeps doing that, so I'm going to indent it back over, I mean, and we're going to say again, it does it again, and say values, right? And that's pretty much going to print what we've got right here. So for example, if the key that the column we're updating is the name column, it's going to say name equal name, and this placeholder, because that's what it is, a placeholder going to contain the value for that name column that we're updating. Hope that makes sense. And so we're going to say where, and this is where our primary key is going to come in. So we're going to say where this key primary key is equal to colon this key primary key. I'm going to say limit. I'm going to put a limit 1 because we only want to update one record at a time. Right, I'm going to indent that back over. I'm going to say if is set this key primary key and this key primary key is equal to 0, then we're going to onset the primary key and we're going to execute that query again, but this time differently, and I'll explain to you in a minute. And say update this key table set values. So what we're saying right here is if we've set a primary key and it's equal to 0, and note the free equal sign, that means it has to equal the actual data type that we specify, which is a string. So it has to equal 0 and the data type has to be a string. And if we're doing that, we're pretty much saying we want to update all the records in our database, which I don't think we're going to be doing in this particular project, but I might be wrong, but I don't think we're going to be doing that, but I am providing the means to do that. Return, I'm going to return the actual string or the actual SQL query or SQL query, and again I'm going to return false if our query type is not valid. And let's quickly look over it, see if I've made any mistakes. There's none that I can see at the moment, so let's jump to the next one, which is our delete query. Say string, and again I'm going to say if this is valid, delete. We're going to again get all the index, so I'm going to say index equal array, array keys, but this time we want this to come from the conditions, and I don't actually think I've got a conditions key in my default, so I need to put a conditions in. Yeah, so let's just put that in. And again, we're going to set that to an empty array because we can have multiple conditions and I want to define that within an array. So we say array keys conditions, and the reason why, I mean, some delete method will just ask for an ID to delete by. You put the ID in the argument and it will delete a record based on that ID you put in. But I want to go with an array option, an array approach, because I can think of scenarios where I might want to delete by something other than the ID. I might want to delete by delete a user if they've done this at that particular time. I want to do that into an array. So I'm trying to be as flexible with this method as possible. So we're saying get all the index of this conditions key value pair. So let's say this SQL query equal delete from this key table, and where index 0, or the first index, is equal colon index 0. Yep. And again, we want to limit that to just 1. But I also want to put in this method a way of deleting multiple records at the same time. So I'm going to say create a next variable called multiple, or let's call it bulk delete. Let's call it bulk delete, that's a better name. I'm going to say equal array value. So we're getting all the values from an array. Just like we've got the array keys, we can get all the keys. We've got a method or a function that's called array values that can fetch all the values of the array. So I say all array values, this field, now this key fields. So we're going to iterate over that. So I'm going to say is an array bulk delete and count. Let's get that right. And count bulk delete is greater than 1. So we went with greater than 1 because if you've only got one element in that array, then there's not multiple records. So we need to only execute this code if there's more than one element. Then we can say, yeah, we've got more than one element, so that can be classed as a bulk. We've got more than one element. So I'm going to say if it's array bulk delete and count bulk delete is greater than 1, I'm going to say for, I'm going to use a for loop this time. I'm going to say create a variable at 0, and I'm going to say I is less than count bulk delete I plus plus, and say this SQL query equal delete from this key table where index is equal 0 equal colon index 0. right? But this time there's going to be no limit, because we're saying if we've got multiple records to delete, then there's no limit on the amount of record we can delete. And this is going to be based on the argument that we put in. So effectively we could do something like got our conditions array, we could say ID, we could set that to a next array, which is what we're doing down here. We're saying if is array bulk delete, and we could have an array of ID like 12, 15, whatever, and that will iterate over these array and delete them. But again, you will see how these are implemented within the code. So I'm going to return this SQL query and return false down here. Yes, I need a semicolon there, and that's PHP for you guys. We need semicolons. You leave it off and you're gonna get a syntax error. So the next bit that we want to tackle is this as conditions method. So down here I'm going to say private function as condition, and it's a private method because we're only going to be using it within this class. It won't be used anywhere else. And what we're going to check with this is I'm going to say if is it this key conditions and this key conditions isn't empty, then if is array this key conditions, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to set it to an empty array. I'm going to say for each. I'm just trying to remember all these code guys, so bear with me for a minute. So I'm going to say for each array keys. I'm going to say, so we want to get the array keys of these conditions. Come back here. Conditions and as where key is where. I'm going to say if is it where key actually let's check if where and where is an empty, going to assign this sort array to where equal colon where. So this is quite similar to what we've done up here. So what this is doing is that if we've got multiple where clauses, we're going to store this within this sort array, and that will basically define multiple conditions within our query, within our select query. So next bit we're going to do is I'm going to say if count this key condition is greater than 0, I'm going to say this SQL query, spell that right, SQL query concatenate this where clause. I'm going to implode implode by this and operator sort, because remember this sort is an array if we've got multiple conditions, so we need to implode that by this and operator, right? Again, it's a little bit difficult to imagine what it looks like, but I'm going to actually get to a stage where we could create some application file and start testing these, so we can see together how they pan out, and then if there's error we can make changes or adjust as we go along. So if is set this conditions and condition isn't empty, execute. So let's say else or else, let's think about this, else if it's empty, this key conditions, then we want to say this SQL query is where 1. What did I miss off? It's parentheses, yep. And that's pretty much it for the where clause of our query. Right, return that. And we just want to return our SQL query. But we also want to actually add pagination and order by statement to our query, so we can actually also do that within this method. I mean, later on we'll start to like refactor and we'll sort of like separate these out into their own method, but for the time being we're going to do if is it this key, and it's going to be, hold on, yeah, order by and this key order by isn't empty. Going to concatenate that onto our query string as well. And denote the dot equal, that's what we're concatenating. So we're going to say order by space this key order by, and this order by is what we've defined in our default, and it's a capital B actually. So let's just copy that string and we've got it right there. Let's paste it right here because it needs to be the same. And we're going to put a space, so if we concatenate anything else onto the string, it's going to have a space. And the next bit that I want to put on actually is also, so like for pagination, we could add offset and limit. So I'm say if it's it this key let's see what we're missing out. Missing out on something. Come on. I think I'm missing out on something. I can't remember what it was. Let's say limit, and this I will remember in a minute when we come to do it. Limit. No. Let's say, so we got if it this key limit and this key offset isn't -1. Just say this SQL query concatenate limit offset limit. I think that bit is right. Again, we're gonna revisit this. We're going to print it out and then we're going to check it that is correct.